It was a peaceful Sunday morning in the small town of Willow Creek, and St. Thomas Church was bathed in the soft glow of early sunlight. The congregation gathered slowly, filling the pews with familiar faces, exchanging warm greetings and gentle smiles. This was their place of comfort, a sacred sanctuary from the troubles of the world. Laughter bubbled up softly here and there, hands clasped in friendly embraces, as people shared stories and plans for the week ahead. Margaret sat near the front, her expression serene yet distant. She offered polite nods to those who greeted her, her lips curved in a small smile, but her eyes held a shadow, a quiet tension that went unnoticed in the warmth of the morning. She glanced subtly across the room, her gaze resting on her husband Thomas, who was caught in a light-hearted conversation with Reverend Peter. To anyone else he looked like his usual self, charming, attentive, fully immersed in the conversation. Yet Margaret saw the faint stiffness in his posture, the almost imperceptible shifts of unease in his eyes. And then there was Clara, the choir director, who was moving gracefully among the choir members as she organized the hymn books, her voice carrying a light musical laugh. She was lively, warm, respected by the congregation, and she had a way of drawing attention without trying. As Clara glanced up, her eyes met Thomas's across the room, and a small, secretive smile passed between them. Margaret noticed, her hand clenching slightly on the hymnal in her lap. She took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm, to keep her composure. She could feel the secrets pressing down on her, invisible yet heavy, hidden beneath the pleasant facade of the Sunday service. The church filled with soft murmurs and the sounds of hymns being rehearsed. To the rest of the congregation, it was just another Sunday morning, quiet, peaceful, perfect. But beneath this calm exterior, Margaret felt something unsettling, an undercurrent of tension that only she seemed to perceive. She closed her eyes, listening to the music, trying to push away the thoughts that clouded her mind. For now, everything appeared normal, but Margaret knew that by the end of the day, the peace of Willow Creek would be forever shattered. The choir's voices swelled gently as the congregation settled, and Margaret took a deep, steadying breath. She cast a quiet glance around the room, observing those closest to her. Here, she was well known, respected, a woman of quiet strength and dignity, a pillar of the community who embodied grace and devotion. Yet, behind her poised exterior, Margaret felt her heart racing. The familiar faces around her no longer brought comfort. They felt like silent witnesses to the secrets she carried. She forced herself to maintain her calm, but every passing moment made it harder to ignore the tension gnawing at her, reminding her of the truth she had uncovered. Across the room, Thomas was the very picture of charm. He laughed easily, shaking hands with friends and exchanging warm greetings with everyone who approached him. To those around him, he was a devoted husband and respected member of the community, someone who had always been admired for his kindness and integrity. But to Margaret, his easy smile had taken on a different meaning, a carefully constructed mask, concealing a man she now saw in a different light. And then there was Clara, the choir director. She moved gracefully, her enthusiasm radiating in every gesture as she spoke with choir members, offering them gentle encouragement. Clara's warmth was contagious, and many saw her as the heart of the church's choir, a passionate leader who brought joy and spirit to their worship. She was lively, charming, and to everyone else a dear friend of Margaret's. But Margaret had seen the small, secret exchanges between Clara and Thomas, the quiet glances, the lingering smiles. To anyone else, their interactions would seem purely professional, perfectly innocent. But Margaret had noticed the subtle signs, the way Clara's gaze would shift to Thomas when she thought no one was watching, the brief flickers of something unspoken passing between them. A wave of anxiety rolled over her, her mind replaying every suspicious moment, every small interaction she had previously dismissed. She watched as Thomas's eyes met Clara's for the briefest second, and a soft, knowing smile played on her husband's lips. Margaret's heart tightened, and she felt her hands clench once more around the hymnal. In that instant, she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. The tension she felt wasn't just in her mind. The quiet betrayal simmered just beneath the surface, hidden from everyone else, but undeniable to her. As the music began, Margaret's gaze drifted back to her lap, her mind whirling with thoughts of the truth she could no longer keep to herself. Today, she told herself, would be the day she confronted them. Here, in the one place where they had both betrayed her trust. As the service began, Margaret's thoughts drifted through the moments that had brought her to this day, each one a piece of the puzzle she had struggled to ignore. She remembered the first faint suspicions, the quiet doubts that had emerged like whispers in the back of her mind. It had started innocently enough. Small things, little inconsistencies. Thomas would come home later than usual, brushing off her questions with explanations that seemed reasonable, though just barely. Extra work at the pharmacy, he would say, or helping a customer after hours. But there was a distance in his voice, a hollowness to his words that made her pause. And then there was Clara. Margaret thought back to the time she had overheard them talking in hushed tones after a church gathering. She hadn't caught the words, but the tone was unmistakable, a low, intimate murmur, the kind that spoke of familiarity, of secrets shared. Her heart had tightened then, but she had forced herself to dismiss it, to believe in the trust they had built. But the signs had continued to accumulate. One evening, while tidying up their bedroom, she had come across Thomas's phone left unlocked. A message from Clara sat on the screen, a simple, "Can't wait to see you," followed by a heart emoji. Margaret had felt a surge of nausea, her fingers trembling as she placed the phone back where she found it, her mind whirling. After that, she had noticed every look, every smile, every touch that passed between them. She saw it in the way Clara's hand would brush Thomas's arm during choir practice, in the glances that lingered just a bit too long. Her suspicions grew, each small confirmation of their connection cutting deeper, leaving her raw and wounded. Now, sitting in the church, she could feel the weight of those moments pressing down on her, the betrayal as sharp as it had been the first time she allowed herself to admit the truth. She glanced over at Thomas, his face calm and composed, his attention seemingly fixed on the Reverend's words. Beside him, Clara was similarly focused, her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene. But Margaret knew better. She could see through the facade they wore, could feel the betrayal pulsing just beneath the surface. Today, she would no longer stay silent. Today, she would tear down the lies, strip away the pretense, and reveal the truth they thought they could keep hidden. Taking a slow, steady breath, she felt the familiar ache of betrayal once more, but this time it fueled her resolve. She looked down at her hands, clenched in her lap, and knew that the moment was near. The Reverend's voice droned on, speaking of grace and forgiveness, themes that Margaret found bitterly ironic. Her heart pounded in her chest as she gathered her courage, the weight of the truth pressing down on her, urging her forward. The murmurs of the congregation filled the sanctuary, soft and reverent, but to Margaret they felt like the hum of anticipation, as if the very walls of the church were waiting for her to speak. Finally, unable to hold back any longer, Margaret rose from her seat. Her movement drew curious glances from those nearby, and as she stepped into the aisle, the Reverend paused, his gaze shifting to her with a faint expression of surprise. All eyes turned toward her, and a hush fell over the room, the silence thick and expectant. Margaret's voice, though trembling, was clear as she looked directly at Thomas, who stared back, confusion etched on his face. "Thomas," she said, her voice carrying through the sanctuary. "There are things that you've kept from me, things that you and I both know can no longer remain hidden." A ripple of surprise passed through the congregation. Thomas's face paled, his eyes widening as he looked around, desperate for something to anchor himself to, but there was no escape from the judgmental eyes fixed upon him. Clara sat frozen in the choir loft, her face drained of color, her hands clutching her hymnal tightly, as if it could shield her from the accusation that hung in the air. Margaret's gaze shifted to Clara, her eyes hardening. "You," she continued, her voice laced with pain and betrayal, "someone I thought was a friend, a sister in faith. You betrayed that trust in the worst way possible." The room was utterly still, the congregation too stunned to react. Some looked at each other, expressions of disbelief mingling with whispers of shock. The choir director, their beloved Clara, involved in an affair with Thomas. The idea seemed impossible, yet Margaret's words left no room for doubt. Thomas stammered, "Margaret, please, let's talk about this in private." His voice was barely a whisper, thick with desperation, his mask of charm and composure shattered. Margaret shook her head, her voice unwavering. "There's no more privacy, no more hiding. You've both made your choices, and now it's time everyone sees you for who you truly are." She held up her phone, displaying the incriminating messages between Thomas and Clara for all to see. Gasps echoed through the church as people craned their necks to catch a glimpse. The proof was undeniable, a stark testament to the betrayal that had been hidden in plain sight. Clara's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes as she looked away, unable to face the judgment of those she had once led in worship. Thomas, too, was lost for words, his expression one of hollow regret, but his silence only deepened the gravity of his guilt. Margaret turned back to the congregation, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I trusted them both, believed in them, and this is how they repaid me. I may never find peace from this, but I can no longer keep their secrets." With that, she turned and walked back down the aisle, her steps steady, her head held high despite the pain etched into her face. The sanctuary remained silent, the weight of the revelation settling over the congregation as they watched her leave. In her wake, Thomas and Clara sat amidst the wreckage of their lies, the full extent of their betrayal laid bare for all to see. In the days that followed Margaret's public revelation, the town of Willow Creek was gripped by a mix of shock, sympathy, and, for some, a lingering sense of fascination with the scandal that had shattered their quiet community. Conversations in coffee shops and whispers in store aisles lingered on the affair, on Margaret's courage, on the secrets that had come to light. But beneath the town's chatter was a growing unease. Thomas and Clara, who had both withdrawn into near-complete isolation, were left to face the town's scorn alone. Each of them became ghosts in Willow Creek, shunned by those who had once welcomed them. The church had felt the impact as well, its congregation torn by gossip, judgment, and the betrayal that had tainted their sanctuary. Then, late one night, a scream pierced the stillness. It was Margaret's neighbor who first discovered her body, after noticing that her front door was ajar in the dark of night. Inside, the scene was one of violent struggle, furniture overturned, picture frames shattered, and in the center of it all, Margaret lay lifeless, her hand clutching a wedding ring. Blood stained the floor, a grim testament to the brutality of the attack. The police arrived quickly, sealing off her home, and soon the quiet street was flooded with flashing lights, horrified neighbors standing outside, watching in stunned silence. Rumors began to spread instantly, voices hushed in fear and sorrow as they realized the scandal had taken a dark, horrific turn. The crime scene offered grim details. Signs of a struggle suggested Margaret had fought back, and yet the final act was swift and calculated, with no sign of a forced entry. The most chilling detail of all was the wedding ring in her hand, a symbol that felt almost like a final, haunting message. This was no random act of violence. It was personal. By morning, Willow Creek was in a state of panic. The small-town scandal that had seemed merely heartbreaking days before had now transformed into something far more sinister. The question on everyone's lips was the same: who could have done this? Whispers of suspicion fell heavily on Thomas, who had lost everything in the wake of the affair. Some speculated that he was consumed with rage after Margaret's public revelation, that he had struck out in revenge. Others pointed to Clara, arguing that she had more than enough motive to want Margaret silenced forever. Yet there were murmurs, too, of a third party, a mysterious figure who had been spotted near Margaret's home the night of the murder, their identity hidden in the shadows. The congregation, already shaken by the scandal, now found themselves gripped by a chilling fear, knowing that someone among them was capable of murder. People avoided each other's gaze, whispers turned to quiet accusations, and in the absence of answers, the community's trust began to crumble. As the police began their investigation, the dark undercurrent that had haunted Willow Creek since the revelation now took on a more terrifying form, and everyone was left to wonder who would be next. Detectives Alison Harper and Mark Ridgway arrived in Willow Creek the following morning, their faces grim as they surveyed the scene. The town was in a state of quiet chaos. Shops closed early, curtains were drawn, and the streets felt abandoned, as if everyone were hiding from a threat they couldn't name. The detectives knew at once that this was no ordinary case. The circumstances surrounding Margaret's murder had cast a shadow over the town, thick with fear, suspicion, and unanswered questions. They began their investigation at Margaret's house, examining every inch of the crime scene. The signs of struggle were clear: overturned furniture, broken picture frames, and the unmistakable symbol of the wedding ring clenched in Margaret's hand. Detective Harper noted it with a frown, understanding its implication. "This was personal," she murmured, glancing at her partner. "Whoever did this wanted to send a message." The list of suspects was short, but tangled in emotional complexity. Thomas, the husband who had been publicly humiliated, was the primary suspect. His grief was tainted with suspicion, as some wondered if he had sought vengeance against the woman who had shattered his reputation and exposed his secrets. When questioned, Thomas appeared hollow, his responses fractured with sorrow and guilt, yet he firmly denied any involvement in Margaret's death. "I may have wronged her," he whispered, his eyes dark with regret, "but I would never take her life." Clara was next in line. Once loved by the congregation for her warmth and dedication, she had now become a figure of distrust and quiet hatred. People whispered that she might have feared Margaret's continued presence in the town, a constant reminder of the affair and the shame that followed. Under questioning, Clara trembled, her voice shaking as she swore her innocence. "Please," she pleaded with Detective Ridgway, "I would never harm Margaret. I made a mistake, a terrible one, but I never wanted her to be hurt." Despite their protests, both Thomas and Clara had motives, their lives entwined in betrayal and loss. Yet the detectives couldn't ignore the rumors circulating among the townspeople, whispers of a deeper web of secrets that extended beyond the affair. As they spoke with members of the congregation, fragments of a larger story began to emerge, hints that Margaret had been looking into something beyond her husband's infidelity. An older woman, a close friend of Margaret's, came forward with a quiet revelation. "Margaret was suspicious about things happening in the church," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She mentioned discrepancies, financial things that didn't add up. She believed someone was hiding something, and she kept notes on it." Intrigued, Detective Harper pressed further, learning that Margaret had indeed been conducting her own quiet investigation into the church's finances and the behavior of certain congregation members. It seemed that Margaret had uncovered secrets beyond the affair, secrets that had the potential to ruin more than just a marriage. The detectives examined her notes, which contained cryptic references to unauthorized withdrawals, questionable donations, and meetings held in secrecy. They began to wonder if Margaret's murder had been an act not just of passion, but of protection, an attempt to silence her before she could reveal damaging truths. As the detectives pieced together the fragments, a chilling realization settled over them. This was no simple murder of a scorned wife exacting revenge. Margaret's death was the result of a tangled conspiracy, one that stretched into the very fabric of the church and its members, and with each new revelation, the list of suspects grew, expanding to include not only Thomas and Clara, but others within the congregation who had something to lose if Margaret's discoveries came to light. The investigation was only beginning, but one thing was certain. In Willow Creek, trust was a fragile thing, and beneath its surface, darkness had taken root. As the investigation deepened, Detectives Harper and Ridgway began to unravel a more complex and sinister web surrounding Margaret's murder. The small-town scandal was no longer just about an affair. It was now about secrets that reached far beyond infidelity, secrets that were never meant to come to light. They delved into Margaret's notes, which revealed even more about her quiet investigation into the church's finances. She had meticulously documented irregularities in donations, discrepancies in church accounts, and unauthorized expenditures, subtle signs of corruption hidden within the very institution meant to uphold moral values. It was clear that Margaret had been preparing to expose the truth, but someone had stopped her before she could. As the detectives questioned members of the congregation, more fragments of Margaret's investigation came to the surface. People mentioned how she had been asking odd questions in the weeks leading up to her death, inquiring about private meetings between certain church leaders, including the treasurer and a few prominent donors. Her inquiries had not gone unnoticed, and it seemed that Margaret's persistence had made her a target. One night, an anonymous tip arrived at the police station. It was a handwritten note, short but telling. She knew too much. She was about to expose us all. The note offered no clues to the sender's identity, but its message was clear. Margaret's death was more than a crime of passion. It was an act of silencing. Rumors began to circulate within Willow Creek, each one adding a new layer to the conspiracy. Some whispered that the treasurer had been embezzling funds and that Margaret had uncovered the discrepancies. Others speculated that a group of influential congregants had been using church funds for personal gain, shielding their actions under the guise of charity work. Each theory pointed to multiple motives, each one hinting at a larger network of individuals who might have wanted Margaret out of the picture. The detectives began to suspect that the murder involved more than just Thomas or Clara. It was beginning to look like a coordinated effort, perhaps orchestrated by someone with both influence and motive. Their suspicions were confirmed when they received word of a witness who had seen a figure near Margaret's home on the night of the murder, a figure shrouded in darkness, wearing a long coat and moving with a purpose that suggested familiarity with the place. The witness couldn't identify the figure but mentioned something peculiar. The person had been holding a small book, as if it were important, a clue that left the detectives wondering if it might have been Margaret's notes. Harper and Ridgway now faced the chilling possibility that someone within the congregation had orchestrated Margaret's murder, not just to protect an affair, but to bury secrets that could ruin lives and reputations. The investigation was no longer a search for a single killer. It was a hunt for a conspiracy that had woven itself into the heart of the church, threatening to unravel the lives of those involved. As they moved forward, the detectives knew that their search would require caution. They were no longer dealing with a crime born out of rage or jealousy, but with a calculated plot, one that would stop at nothing to protect the secrets hidden in Willow Creek. As word of the possible conspiracy spread through Willow Creek, the once close-knit community began to fracture. People who had spent years worshipping side by side now looked at each other with suspicion, their conversations tinged with fear and doubt. Friends became wary, and families began questioning one another, wondering who might have been involved in the scandal that Margaret had uncovered. Detectives Harper and Ridgway intensified their investigation, honing in on individuals who had connections to the church's finances or private dealings with influential congregants. With every new interview, tensions mounted. Subtle accusations turned into outright hostility as the detectives uncovered disturbing details about certain members of the congregation, particularly Clara and Thomas. Thomas, already crushed by the weight of the affair and the suspicion of murder, grew increasingly paranoid. His once confident demeanor faded, replaced by anxious glances and frantic whispers. In every interaction with the detectives, he insisted on his innocence, yet his behavior hinted at a man unraveling, a man who feared he was being framed by the very people he had once trusted. Clara, too, was not immune to the scrutiny. Her reputation had been tainted by the affair, and now, with rumors of a conspiracy swirling, her role within the church was questioned even more severely. Members of the congregation who had once adored her began to view her with distrust, some even suggesting that she had manipulated others within the church to cover her tracks. Under pressure, Clara found herself increasingly isolated, her desperation growing as she tried to salvage her standing in a community that now saw her as both a betrayer and a potential conspirator. As the detectives pressed Thomas and Clara for answers, they each began to subtly implicate one another, casting shadows of blame in a desperate attempt to clear their own names. Thomas hinted that Clara had more to lose if Margaret's discoveries were revealed, suggesting that she had a deeper involvement in the church's finances than anyone knew. Clara, in turn, pointed out that Thomas had the most to gain from Margaret's silence, implying that his desperation to save his reputation could have driven him to murder. The congregation watched as the once affectionate pair turned on each other, their mutual trust shattered, each one more frantic than the last to avoid being implicated. People whispered that perhaps they had conspired together to silence Margaret, only for guilt and fear to pull them apart in the face of the investigation. Detectives Harper and Ridgway took note of the escalating tensions, watching as Willow Creek descended further into suspicion and paranoia. But they were also aware of a third possibility, one that lingered in the back of their minds. What if neither Thomas nor Clara had committed the murder, but had been manipulated into believing the other had? What if there was another player in the shadows, orchestrating the division between them to keep the real motives hidden? The detectives pressed on, sifting through a growing tangle of accusations, secrets, and betrayals, each thread leading them deeper into the heart of the church's dark secrets. And as they drew closer to the truth, they began to sense that the true mastermind behind Margaret's murder was someone far more calculating, someone who had quietly woven themselves into the fabric of Willow Creek, hiding in plain sight. The town, once united in faith, now stood on the brink of collapse, and in the silence that followed each revelation, Willow Creek held its breath, waiting for the truth that would change everything. As the detectives drew closer to uncovering the full extent of the conspiracy, they stumbled upon a key piece of evidence, a journal entry from Margaret herself. Hidden among her belongings, the entry detailed a discovery she had made just days before her murder, an unauthorized financial transaction involving a large sum from the church's account, directed to a private account under an alias. The revelation left detectives Harper and Ridgway stunned. This wasn't just about an affair or petty grievances. It was about money, power, and a hidden network operating within the church. The detectives knew that whoever controlled that account had a great deal to lose if Margaret's notes were ever exposed. With this final piece of the puzzle, they called an emergency meeting with Thomas, Clara, and a few other prominent members of the congregation who had come under suspicion during the investigation. They convened in the back room of the church, a dimly lit space where the shadows seemed to gather, thick with the tension that had gripped Willow Creek. Detective Harper spoke first, her voice steady but firm, her eyes sweeping over each face in the room. "We know that Margaret's murder wasn't just a crime of passion. She had uncovered something far more significant, evidence of financial corruption within the church, and we believe that this corruption goes deeper than any of you would like to admit." The room fell silent, the accused shifting uncomfortably under her gaze. Thomas looked pale, his eyes darting to Clara, who sat stiffly, her fingers gripping the edge of her chair. Ridgway held up Margaret's journal, his voice grave. Margaret had been documenting discrepancies in the church's finances for weeks. She traced unauthorized funds back to an account under an alias that we believe belongs to someone in this room. A murmur rippled through the room, the tension rising as people exchanged wary glances. Clara's face blanched as she realized the depth of Margaret's investigation, the threat that her discoveries posed to more than just her affair with Thomas. But it was the treasurer, Mr. Lane, a quiet, unassuming man who had handled the church's finances for years, who broke the silence. His face was a mask of feigned innocence, but Harper noticed a flicker of fear in his eyes. This is absurd," he stammered. Margaret was a grieving woman, not an investigator. She was imagining things, seeing patterns that weren't there. Ridgway stepped forward, his voice steely. "Mr. Lane, Margaret had evidence that linked you directly to the missing funds. She was about to reveal it all, wasn't she?" Lane's composure faltered, his hands trembling slightly as he searched for a response. I don't know what you're talking about," he stuttered, his voice barely a whisper. But his denial only served to heighten the suspicion in the room. Thomas, catching on to the shift in attention, seized the opportunity. "If Lane is involved, who's to say he didn't manipulate me, push me into this whole situation with Margaret and Clara? Who's to say he isn't the one who wanted her silenced?" At this, Clara, too, found her voice, pointing a finger at Lane, desperation evident in her tone. "You were the one who approached me about church donations, who encouraged me to turn a blind eye to the finances. I trusted you, and now you're making me look guilty." The room erupted into accusations, each person scrambling to protect themselves as the web of lies unraveled. Lane's mask slipped, his calm exterior giving way to anger and desperation. His voice rose above the din, a mixture of guilt and defiance. "Yes, I did it," he spat, his eyes blazing with resentment. "Margaret threatened everything I'd worked for. She was going to ruin me, expose secrets that went far beyond your petty affair. I couldn't let her destroy it all." The confessions sent shockwaves through the room, everyone silenced by the gravity of his words. Harper and Ridgway stepped forward, their expressions a mixture of relief and horror at the confession they had elicited. Lane looked around, realizing the weight of his admission. His face crumpled, his shoulders slumping as he grasped the reality of his actions. "I never wanted it to come to this," he murmured almost to himself. "But she gave me no choice." With his confession, the conspiracy was laid bare, and the once united congregation stood divided, each member grappling with the truth of how far someone would go to protect their secrets. As the truth sank in, an oppressive silence filled the room. Mr. Lane, the trusted treasurer who had quietly managed the church's finances for years, stood exposed, his confession unraveling any remaining sense of security the congregation had clung to. His betrayal was not just a personal failing, It was a betrayal of the entire community's trust, the very foundation upon which their faith had been built. Thomas and Clara sat in stunned silence, each grappling with their own guilt and shame. Their affair, once the center of the scandal, now felt like a shadow of the larger deception that had ensnared them all. Thomas glanced around the room, his mind reeling. The affair had ruined his life, yet it was only one thread in the web of lies that had brought them all to this point. His guilt felt small in the face of Lane's confession, but it did nothing to absolve him of the pain he had caused Margaret. Clara, too, was overwhelmed by a sense of desolation. She had been part of the chain of secrets that had led to Margaret's death, and now her reputation lay in ruins. The congregation that had once adored her now viewed her with contempt, and the thought of rebuilding her life seemed impossible. Her actions had betrayed both her faith and her community, and the weight of that knowledge was suffocating. Detective Harper broke the silence, her tone somber but resolute. What happened here is more than just a crime. It's a violation of everything this community stands for. Trust has been shattered, and the consequences of that betrayal will reach far beyond this room. As the detectives escorted Mr. Lane out, the remaining members of the congregation were left to grapple with the fallout of his confession. The once close community was torn apart, divided between those who sought solace in forgiveness and those who wanted to distance themselves from the scandal that had tainted their place of worship. Some members of the congregation left the church altogether, unable to reconcile their faith with the corruption and deceit that had come to light. Attendance dwindled, and the once bustling sanctuary began to feel hollow, a symbol of the shattered trust that could not easily be restored. Thomas and Clara attempted to rebuild their lives in the aftermath, but their reputations were permanently tarnished. People in town avoided them, conversations halted when they entered a room, and whispers followed them wherever they went. The stain of their actions would linger, a constant reminder of the choices that had led to such tragic consequences. In the weeks that followed, Willow Creek found itself grappling with questions that went beyond the immediate scandal. People began to question their own assumptions, their trust in one another, and the darker undercurrents that had gone unnoticed for so long. The murder, the affair, the conspiracy. It had all forced the town to confront the fragility of the bonds that held them together. For Detective Harper and Detective Ridgway, the case left a lasting impact. They had exposed the truth, but at a cost that felt too high. As they left Willow Creek, they couldn't shake the lingering feeling that some things, once broken, could never truly be mended. They had solved the case, yet the damage to the town's spirit felt irreparable, a stark reminder of the darkness that could lurk even within the closest communities. In Willow Creek, faith had once been a source of unity, but now it was a reminder of the cost of betrayal, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed voices, a legacy of the secrets that had destroyed them from within. As time passed, Willow Creek struggled to find a new normal, yet the scars of Margaret's murder and the revelations that had followed left a deep mark on the town. Those who continued to attend St. Thomas Church did so in smaller numbers, the pews emptier than ever, the air heavy with memories of the scandal that had nearly torn the community apart. Friends who had once shared warm smiles now avoided each other's gazes, conversations strained by unspoken accusations and lingering suspicions. Detective Harper and Detective Ridgway returned to their lives, but the events in Willow Creek haunted them both. They'd exposed a tangled web of lies and deceit, yet the victory felt hollow, weighed down by the knowledge that justice came at such a terrible price. Harper, especially, found herself reflecting on the fragility of trust, on how easily the appearance of unity could be shattered by secrets. She wondered if she would ever see another small town the same way again, knowing that darkness could hide in even the most familiar of places. Back in Willow Creek, Thomas and Clara lived as outcasts, shadows of their former selves, bound by guilt and the reality that their actions had irrevocably altered their lives and their community. They avoided public places, each day a reminder of their mistakes and the lives they had helped destroy. Forgiveness seemed a distant hope, and though they each tried to move on, the memory of Margaret lingered, a silent ghost that neither could escape. For the congregation, the tragedy became part of the town's lore, a cautionary tale shared with newcomers and remembered with a mix of sorrow and regret by those who had lived through it. Parents would tell their children about the dangers of deception, warning them that even the smallest secrets could grow into something monstrous if left unchecked. And though the church remained open, it was no longer the comforting sanctuary it had once been. St. Thomas Church became a symbol of both betrayal and resilience, a reminder of the darkness that could lurk beneath the surface of a seemingly peaceful community.